Hi guys, I wanted to go over the paper on early American ideals and just kind of offer a verbal explanation and walk through the assignment sheet. All right, so overall, the biggest prompt that your paper is analyzing or that your paper is responding to is where in modern America, meaning today's time, do we see the ideals of early American lit expressed or rejected? And then I'm offering you some focal locations in modern America. Law and practice, that's really broad. You can interpret that however you want. In political rhetoric or like political language, campaign speeches, things that the government is, like policies, administrative policies, things like that. Or in popular media, film, TV, art, music. Popular media covers lots of things. I think those four things cover a lot of other little things. Okay, so where do we see some of the ideals of early American lit still today, either still being expressed, like, okay, we have the same, or this that in this place has the same ideal as this writer of early American lit, or rejected, meaning we now do not agree with an ideal that we see in early American lit. When you're thinking of this prompt, think of it like where in modern America, not necessarily all of modern America. I think that's too, you can't necessarily say, well, all of society rejects this belief, because that's probably never going to be true. Instead, you could say this part of society, maybe like these government policies reject this early American ideal, or these contemporary government policies still uphold and express this early American ideal. Okay, so that's what I want you to do. Now that's like your basic, broadest prompt. I explain it a little bit further in the paragraph right below the prompt. I want you to select an ideal, and I'm going to come back to my little star here and explain ideal in just a minute, but I want you to select an ideal found in at least one of the early American texts in 231. And I think that, again, as you're approaching this prompt, don't think, oh, every single writer has to have had this ideal. We're really not going to be able to identify too many things that every single writer believes in. So as long as just one text is expressing an ideal, and you can either find that ideal expressed also in contemporary times or rejected in contemporary times in a specific subset of our American culture or government or whatever, then that's what you want to do. And I really, really do strongly encourage you guys to pick a specific focus. Pick one text or two texts and the ideal being expressed in that, and then find a narrow subset of contemporary America where you see that ideal expressed or rejected. Okay, so like, for example, that could be in Christian churches, right? We're not talking about all of America, but maybe in modern Christian churches. And you could even narrow that down further. You could talk about, like non-denominational modern churches, or the like mega churches that you see. Or you could say, well, in this one particular movie, or in this one director's, like every movie this director ever makes, I see this ideal from William Bradford being rejected. I think that a really, really good paper will find a very specific focus for its early American ideal, and also how it's connecting that to modern America, and that part will be very focused as well. Okay. You guys are starting this, like I'm introducing this paper early on in the unit, so that you have plenty of time to work on it. However, you can pick any text that we will read. What that means is that if we haven't read the text yet, but you're like, maybe you have some familiarity with it, maybe the title interests you, or if you've done some previewing of the texts, then please feel free to pick anything to work through this paper, even if we haven't quite got there yet. Okay, so begin by analyzing the early American text or texts. It's fine to use more than one, and I would try to limit yourself. I wouldn't go over 3. 3 feels like too much. 2 is probably fine. 1 is great, but I would say if you're thinking of bringing in more than 3 of our early American texts, unless they are very short texts that all relate, you might just want to limit yourself to no more than 3. However, you guys really have control over your decision on that. This is just a suggestion. So begin by analyzing the early American text or texts in order to isolate and identify the ideal written about. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that you need to read that text and ask yourself, okay, so I've read the words from this author, but like, what is the ideal being expressed? And I want to come down here really quickly to my first star, which is the concept of an ideal. I would love to assume that you all totally understand what an ideal is, and so this doesn't need to be explained, but just in case, I want to talk about the difference between an idea versus an ideal. An idea is just something that pops into your head, right? Oh, I have this idea. It's a thought. An ideal is something that is also a thought, but it's a thought of like perfection. So ideal in our context is something that the writers of early American lit sought out as perfection. So the ideal or the perfect society, the ideal or the perfect Christian, the ideal American. Even we will get into concepts of the ideal Native American, or writers will talk about the ideal enslaved person. And, you know, we're talking about like those who did the enslaving, saying, okay, well, here's the perfect or the ideal person to enslave, or once you have done that, right? The ideal government. So that's what I'm talking about. Like, what do the writers see as, oh, this is the perfect setup in any of these contexts? So that's what I'm looking for. Not just an idea, but an ideal, a perfection. Something they were like, well, in the best society we could create, this is what we need to have. Okay, so that's what I want you to identify is, what is the ideal? Just doing that in and of itself requires analysis. And so as you structure your paper, and I'll try to come back to this again, but as you structure your paper, that's where you want to start with your first couple of body paragraphs, is isolating and identifying the ideal that's being written about. Showing me the writing, showing me the language of the author, and saying, okay, he or she says this, and so it's clear, working me through your thought process, this is their ideal. In a perfect world, this would be their ideal. Okay. So that's kind of step 1 of this, is what is the ideal, and I need you to prove it to me in your paper. Then I want you to argue where you see, and I've got a typo here. I want you to argue where you see the ideal expressed or rejected in modern America. Okay, so now you have a decision to make. You've already said, all right, here's the ideal from the early American text or texts that I've read. Now you have to decide, is this ideal something that you see others expressing today? Or is it something that you see others rejecting today? Now, if you decide, well, in some circles they express it, and in other circles they reject it, depending on how you want to approach your paper, you could write about both, But I would say you might just want to focus on one, because if you pick one focus, expressed or rejected, then you get to study that a little bit deeper than something more surface level. Because if you talk about both, the ideal being expressed here but rejected over here, then you have to cover more content in a shorter amount of time, and you only get, some little bit of surface level. If you instead just pick a focus, right? If you say, okay, I'm only going to talk about how this ideal is expressed in this one place, and you're just going to ignore the fact that it might be rejected in other places, that will give you more of an opportunity to dig deeper and focus on how that ideal is expressed, okay? Or vice versa, rejected, whichever one you focus on. It's fine to talk about both. I don't mind at all. But just, you don't have to. Even if you have the opportunity to, you don't have to. Okay, so again, be sure that your paper has a clear focus. You don't want to just say, oh, the ideal of a perfect society is it still expressed in the world today. Like, that's way too vague. Even just saying the ideal society is too vague. I want you to identify, well, what is this author's concept of an ideal society? And where in modern America do you see it expressed today? Again, an argument that says all of society agrees on this ideal's expression or disagrees on this ideal's expression is not going to hold up, because I don't think that will be true. Not all of society agrees on pretty much anything. Okay, so your analysis and connection should be effective, unique, and interesting. I want to talk about unique as well, because, the question that I always get from a lot of students is, how can I possibly write something unique about texts that were written hundreds of years ago, and so many people have written about them, and I'm worried that I might plagiarize, because if, you Google my paper and maybe I've talked about something that someone else has thought of. That's a common concern. When I say unique, what I just mean is, don't Google your text. Don't go to Google to try and find an answer for this prompt. You already need to have an answer yourself, and then you can Google things to help you research your claim. But don't find your claim on Google. And as long as you're doing that, and you guys, I can tell the difference, and you're probably like, how's she gonna know? Just trust me, I'm gonna know. As long as you are not Googling early American ideals in, early American lit, or as long as you're not Googling this prompt, then you should be just fine. Basically, if you are confident that you wrote this paper without seeking out someone else's analysis, then I will know inherently that it's unique to you. Okay? I can tell the difference between student writing and articles and scholarly articles that are published online. So just know that you don't need to worry about it. If it's genuinely unique to you, I will see that. Okay. Here is an example thesis statement. The Puritan ideal of a charitable society, as seen in Winthrop's iconic sermon, is still publicly present in most Christian-based organizations in modern society. I should probably change this to modern American society. Is still publicly present in most Christian-based organizations in modern American society, although modern greed does not usually allow genuine facilitation of the ideal of charity. Okay, so the ideal, again, if we look at that thesis statement and we walk back through the explanation of the prompt, begin by analyzing the early American text to isolate and identify the ideal written about. Okay, so in my thesis, I have told you what text I'm looking at. What is it? Winthrop's iconic sermon, right? The sermon that we read in week 2. Then identify the ideal, right? What is the ideal? It's the Puritan ideal of a charitable society, or just the ideal of charity, like how to be the perfect charitous person. Charitous, is that a word? I don't know. Then argue as to where you see it expressed or rejected in modern America. So do we see that in a thesis? Yes. Publicly present, right, expressed in most Christian-based organizations. Now, my final clause in my thesis is that modern greed does not usually allow the genuine facilitation of the ideal. And so really what this paper would be talking about is that, yes, the Christian-based organizations express the ideals of charity. Like, yes, we are charitous, we do give, we give as much as we can, but I think I would also be working to, in this paper, to say, despite that being the facade of the situation, maybe underneath it's not actually that perfect ideal that Winthrop is talking about, because I might find examples of where money that could have gone to charity was used for personal gain for some of higher up people running a Christian-based organization. So that is an example thesis statement. It's very focused, right? I'm not talking about all of American society. Now I could narrow this down even further and pick a specific Christian-based organization if I wanted to, and that would be perfectly fine. Another thing that I'll talk about is that you might have to do some research. So you're like, okay, but Ms. Osborne, you just said don't Google anything. Don't Google to get your thesis. Like, you need to already know your thesis, okay? But like I said, if I was looking, let's say I wanted to, in my paper, make this final claim that modern greed doesn't usually allow for that all Christian-based organizations to be purely charitous, how can I find examples of that? Well, I might not have any. That's what I might need to research. So I do not want you to research any of the analysis of your early American texts, but if you need to research anything about modern America, you can do that. Does that make sense? I hope so. Please email me if it doesn't. So the structure of a literature paper is the same as the structure of all of your other papers. It has an introduction, it has body paragraphs, it has a conclusion. The introduction has a hook sentence. You develop that introduction by introducing basically you need to give context in order to lead into the thesis. Context includes identifying, authors and titles and a quick summary of the text that you're reading. If you're going to be talking about a very, very, very specific facet of modern America, you want to give some context to that. And then you end it on a thesis statement. To be really, really clear, I expect that your thesis is the last sentence in your introduction. In your body paragraphs, you always begin with a topic sentence and you end with a concluding sentence. Never, ever, 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 never, never start with a quote. Never, never, never end with a quote. Ever. Never do that. Ever. Never, ever. Okay. So just in the first and last sentences of every body paragraph, especially when you're writing about literature, need to be your words, beginning and end, your words. Quote in the middle, analysis, summary, context, all that good, juicy stuff goes in the middle. Boring, blanket topic sentence in your words and concluding sentence in your words. Conclusion, I don't read conclusions to the point of trying to pick apart what's wrong with your conclusion. You should just restate your thesis and explain why this is important. Okay. You do need a works cited page. So obviously you need to cite any of the early American texts that you are bringing up in your paper. You also need to cite, if you do research modern America, you need to cite any sources that you use there. You should have an MLA 8th edition works cited page, and you need to have MLA 8th edition in-text citations. If you do not know how to do that, definitely see the resources in LMS now, or send me an email. 4 full pages. You can go over 4. Probably try not to go over 6. I mean, if it's 10, it's fine. Anything more than 10, I'm gonna probably stop reading at some point. Use MLA format, standard grammar, stuff like that. And then the rubric is down here, and I'm grading you based on a little bit of formatting, grading your thesis. Can you identify the ideal? Can you connect it to modern America? How are you, I need to change this. How are you in finding, like, what evidence are you providing? Is it effective evidence? Evidence comes from the text, okay? So evidence is like when you're saying this is the early American ideal, and maybe you say Winthrop wanted a perfectly charitist society. How do you know? The evidence is the text. You're bringing the text into your paper. If you do not quote anywhere in your paper, it's not a good enough paper. It might be a good paper, but it's not good enough. Evidence also comes from connections you make to modern America. So finding specific examples in modern America to support that either express of the ideal or reject expression of the ideal or rejection of the ideal. That's the evidence for that. So again, if I'm saying, okay, here's some examples of how in modern America this is rejected, that's your evidence, okay? And then your analysis is making those connections, okay? So all literature papers have 3 basic elements: evidence, analysis, and interpretation. And if you wanted to think of this, if you're like a math inclined person, if you wanted to think of it like this, evidence plus analysis equals interpretation. The interpretation is your thesis statement. You can't get a thesis statement without both evidence and analysis, because the text isn't telling you your thesis. You are interpreting the text to get to your thesis. But the process of doing that is saying, look at this text, I'm going to analyze it, and that's going to like lead me to my thesis, aka my interpretation. So I'm not only looking at your evidence, but I'm looking at what you do with that evidence, which is your analysis. Okay. And then of course I'm looking at the development of your essay and the structure. I would encourage you to start your paper by, a couple of paragraphs, body paragraphs, talking about how you see this early American ideal, like where you see it, and analyzing it and making sure that you can prove that these writers or this writer actually does have this ideal. Then spend the second half of your paper connecting that to modern America and proving whether or not it's expressed or rejected and where. I wouldn't try to do all that in every paragraph. I would just start with the ideal, and then I would move on to the connection to modern America. So that's the assignment sheet, and that's pretty much everything that I have to say about it. If you have any questions, please send me an email and let me know.